Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. And today, we're gonna come in a little bit hot and discuss 5 huge mistakes that Baldur's Gate 3 makes that Dungeon Masters should absolutely avoid in their own games of D&D.
Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the most incredible video games that's ever come out, period. But the game that has inspired Baldur's Gate, which is Dungeons & Dragons, is often played at a table with a group of friends, and some of the rules and plot devices used in Baldur's Gate might not work at your game tables. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
Now make no mistake, Baldur's Gate 3 is a masterpiece. It is unequivocally our game of the year for 2023. It is an exemplar of the form of the CRPG genre. It is an amazing story, and it is a fantastic game. And there is a lot from Baldur's Gate 3 that is worth drawing on for inspiration, especially for new players that might be excited about trying out what they experienced in Baldur's Gate 3 on the tabletop.
Now, the mistakes that we're talking about today are not necessarily mistakes within Baldur's Gate 3. They're more mistakes that would happen if you tried to adapt what happens in Baldur's Gate 3 and apply it to a tabletop. These mistakes are ones that Larian Studios built into the game on purpose because they were masterfully designing a game inspired by Dungeons & Dragons with a lot of the rule sets in there, and they tweaked things where they saw fit. I often say that we teach you the rules so that you know how to break them properly, and Larian Studios knows how to break rules properly. The overall package of what you get in Baldur's Gate 3 is phenomenal, near perfection, with what we consider a few minor drawbacks that you barely notice. But if you were playing it at a table with your group of friends and a dungeon master, these might become glaring mistakes.
And of course, spoiler warning, we're going to be discussing all elements of the game. Kelly's wrapped up his playthrough as well, and so we're going to be ripping off the hood of this whole thing and discussing every element of the story and gameplay.
The first design mistake in Baldur's Gate 3 is fake time pressure. This comes with the initial design of the overarching plot. The worms aren't actually a time threat, although at the very outset of the game, I remember when I first started the game, I thought that if I didn't do something, that terrible things were going to happen to me and my companions. And they really instill this sense of fear into you that at a certain point you realize was never actually there. And it creates false urgency right from the start of the game.
It's made a lot worse in Baldur's Gate 3 because so much of your relationships with your companions and the story advances when you take a long rest. And for myself, in my first playthrough of the game, I pushed really, really hard after the crash to get someone that could help me with this Mind Flayer parasite, because the game really creates the impression that if you take too many long rests, that you're going to turn into a Mind Flayer imminently. This gets reinforced several times, and it is a slow realization that that's actually not what's going to happen. This is a double issue because this time pressure, especially at the beginning of the game, really works against us getting to know the characters and the world. There's this immediate, massive threat to ourselves, and we're going to die if we don't do something about it immediately. And so it does work against the whole idea that you want to explore the world and get to know the characters and get to understand the conflicts and help out with these sorts of things. And I do think that this is one of those things that it smooths out once you know what's actually happening in the game. But for a first-time impression of the experience, it was kind of jarring.
I'll say that you also have a chance of missing major elements of the game because you're pushing so hard to try to find a solution to the immediate problem. And that can be another major issue. I do think that when we're talking about this, again, in the narrative of a video game, this is just part of the story, and the video game isn't actually going to have a clock running to your inevitable death. But when we bring the game to life on the tabletop, if you're adding in time pressure, it's very important that it actually matters. The players need to make interesting decisions that could have the fate of certain elements of the story in their hands. What are they going to do with the problems presented to them in the time limit that they have? This creates a really interesting dynamic at the table, but when you're at the table and you find out that the DM is just saying that you have 3 days to discover the truth of the situation, and really those 3 days are going to go by as the DM sees fit, depending on how you guys are navigating the story, and you realize partway through that you can actually dilly-dally all you want, it kind of takes away the agency.
Yeah, and time pressures are a really interesting thing in video games in general, and can create a lot of tension and excitement when they are used really, really well. I'm more of a fan of a more abstract sort of time pressure, like a doom clock. And I do really like making it explicit when there is a time pressure. I love games like XCOM where there is a very clear countdown to doom, and you as the player know, oh, this is actually a lose condition in a very, very clear and obvious way. In my experience, having run games like the Red Hand of Doom, where there was a very clear time pressure, and even in my own Drakkenheim campaign, where there is this ambiguous high-level meta time pressure, or when I did our Time Loop campaign, where it was very clear you had 3 days, a time pressure that is measured in days is very meaningful in a tabletop game, but if the time pressure is not days, it really doesn't resonate otherwise, at least in my experience. Maybe, other people have played larger games where it was like a multi-year sort of time pressure, but I think that that's a lot harder to navigate, right?
Well,
I think of the original Fallout where like you technically had a year to do it, but that was a lot of time.
Well, even our time loop campaign was inspired a little bit by Majora's Mask, where if you want to talk about time pressure, when I played Majora's Mask, the amount of pressure I felt playing that game versus Ocarina of Time, the moment that you realize that you have 3 days, you immediately kind of go into panic mode. And I feel like you play the entire game of Majora's Mask on the edge of your seat.
Yeah, and Baldur's Gate 3 sets you up with that level of panic mode and then it fizzles out.
You kind of just like, you start off being like, oh my God, I need to do something about this. Mm-hmm. And then you're like, wait.
And another very pertinent issue is they kind of do it again. It happens again in Act 2 with the whole thing with the Shadow Curse. And it's very abstract if you have time to save Last Light in or not. And then it happens again in Act 3 when one of your companions gets kidnapped by Orin. And it's also not clear how much time you actually have to rescue them.
Because you have as much time as you need.
Yeah. And so it's weird that they made this mistake 3 times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, the video game is great and the story's great. It's just, if you tried to pull that at the table, it wouldn't feel right.
Yeah. And definitely I felt, especially when Orin kidnaps one of your party members in the 3rd act, I felt like I just had to drop absolutely everything and rescue them.
I mean, she kidnapped Helsing, so I'm like, keep
for me it was Lizelle, and I was kind of like, oh, like Lizelle was cool in my playthroughs, but I thought Lizelle had some of the most character development over the course of the game.
We can do a different video on our favorite characters in Baldur's Gate 3. The next design mistake is allies of necessity. This is the idea that, again, kind of relating back to the whole worm fiasco and, oh my God, we're all going to die. The companions in Baldur's Gate 3 do not necessarily get along at all.
They hate each other. They all hate each other at the start of the game.
Lizelle straight up is like, kill this person. Like they want you to, like, they're telling you, like, let's murder this other companion. Yeah. There's a whole bunch of that. None of the companions get along. They would never work together. But the only reason why they are working together is because of the shared parasite situation that is a false time crunch. So, But
also, like, the mind meld thing kind of smooths over. Like, Asterion pulls a knife on you. I would just, if that had have been the interaction to the party in a tabletop game, that would have been it, right? Um, so many people miss Gale because he's reaching out of a scary portal. Will and Karlak want to kill each other at the start of the game, and Lizelle, yeah, hates everybody.
Yeah. So at no point, like, the game kind of smooths it out. And actually, that's the other thing, is you don't actually have to do much other than some conversation points and trying to like you can have them continue to hate each other, but you can smooth it out pretty easily just by talking to them. And so again, this is sort of, I mean, if you're playing at a table, the worst way to start is to have all the players at the table hate each other. It's not a great intro to your D&D game. You actually want the opposite, and you want to talk about why your party dynamic, why they all will work together. You need to find that connective tissue, not just you meet in a tavern, not, oh, you were on a crash from a spaceship and you have parasites in your head, so now you're all BFFs. That doesn't work at the table.
Yeah, and the game does acknowledge it. Like, you can have Lizelle and Shadowheart literally kill each other, depending on how the interactions go. And you can go down the dialogue options that lead to the companions actually getting offed, and you can kill Asterion when he pulls the knife on you as well. Like, there are every one of the companions basically is optional in that regard. But I really felt for myself, combined with the fake time pressure, the biggest thing that I felt that Baldur's Gate 3 would have been improved by would have by having a prologue where you got to know everybody and meet in a context before you were kidnapped by the Mind Flayer Nautiloid, and have some shared adventures. And so if I was trying to recreate that sort of feeling in a actual D&D game, what I would probably do is have that extended prologue where the player characters all go on some shared adventures together, and then the disaster happens that brings them together and creates that time pressure.
I will say that this one, more so than the first one, this is an issue that works really well in Baldur's Gate 3.
Because it's a video game.
Because it's a video game. So in a video game, having your assorted allies have issues with one another is actually way more interesting. And you having to deal with, oh my gosh, are they going to kill each other? That's way more interesting. But the fact is, this is a, well, single player game, quote unquote. You can play it with friends, but that's a different story. But when you're playing D&D, instead of Lizelle, Shadowheart, and Asterion, you have other players at the table. And so bringing that expectation to your table, being like, hey, let's have it so that my character hates your character. Again, actually, what I'm describing now, if in session 0, you and another player decide that your characters hate each other, but you're both experienced at D&D and you have worked with, like, if you're a well-established group, you can make this work by talking about how you're not going to interrupt the narrative that's unfolding before you with your silly bickering. You're just going to play into that trope. But that's very different. If you kind of sit down at a table, you're a new group of players, and all the players are like, let's try to kill each other, it's not going to work.
Yeah, and in this respect, Larian's sort of calling card, they do this in almost all of their games. They did it in Divinity Original Sin 2, and the previous Divinity is this idea of the story starts with a bunch of cursed protagonists. In Divinity Original Sin 2, you're all sorcerers within that setting, which is the weird magic system there. You're all on a shipwreck, and then you end up as prisoners. Or you are prisoners, and so you have both, like, the shipwreck and the prison escape, plus everyone's united by their shared curse.
I think that was also the start of Pillars of Eternity. It may have
been. And I'm just going to say, like, that motif, the shipwrecked prisoners that all have a shared curse, works really, really well in single-player video games. It does not work nearly as well in tabletop games, because with a video game, the protagonist, especially if you do, like, your own TAV in BG3, or if you're playing as Dark Urge, like, you're basically a blank slate amnesiac as the main character, and all the other NPCs get to have their backstory, but they're not necessarily interwoven with one another. I do personally really think that like Mass Effect and Dragon Age both did a better job at weaving together the various characters in their parties and making their relationships more interesting and varied.
I agree.
I just felt that like the individual characters in Baldur's Gate 3 are amazing, and I like Garrus is pretty top tier. Morrigan is pretty top tier. I don't now I'm starting to think of like which protagonists and companions from those games.
I loved so many of the Mass Effect's one of my favorite games as a character study and as how to do a video game where choices and characters all matter.
Yeah, Garrus and Rex really. I don't know if the
Liara. I mean,
Liara.
How dare you? That's anyway.
Liara was fun, but I think yeah, Liara. Okay, the Mass Effect character cast is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Right. And no, not to sell the Baldur's Gate 3 characters short at all. I think
but they're all individually some of the best written characters ever. But what Mass Effect did really well is, first of all, Commander Shepard's relationship with those characters. Now, mind you, obviously Baldur's Gate is basically half a dating sim. So but I felt more invested in the narratives of the interweaving of the characters in Mass Effect.
Yeah, that definitely was something that I felt was much stronger there. However, nonetheless, and overall, I do feel coming out of like comparing to Mass Effect and Dragon Age Origins in particular, you very much have less of this allies of necessity thing happening in those games compared to Baldur's Gate 3. I feel like the inclusion of each character is much more organic in those games. And for me, that I just think I prefer that in general. And I would rather, I think in tabletop games, I like a more organic coming together of the party. And I think one of the challenges of this and where DMs often go to this is a very classic dilemma for a dungeon master is how do you get the party together in the first place? Yeah. And so having them all cursed with the same thing or all prisoners in the same thing or recruited into the same army is a really convenient way of getting them together. But what I've come to learn over the years is that it doesn't have to be your job as the dungeon master to explain why the player characters are working together. It's the player character's job to decide why their characters are working together. And I put that responsibility on my players. And if I'm not happy with what I come up with, I'm like, guys, you're going to have to do more. But it is totally okay for you as a DM to say, hey, players, figure out why all your characters like each other, why they're staying together, why they're going to stick together through thick and thin. That's your job, not mine.
As a final note, as I was thinking about it, you brought this up, but I think one of the reasons why Mass Effect entangled me in the narrative more was because Commander Shepard was not a blank slate.
Yeah.
He had a personality. You get to choose how his personality develops, but he had his own voice, his own cutscenes, his own interaction.
Totally. And even if you're playing Dark Urge in Baldur's Gate 3, because Dark Urge is still this amnesiac that is dealing with this curse, like you're kind of fighting against that dark urge, literally. Yeah.
In Baldur's Gate 3, you feel like a bit of nothing with a whole bunch of awesome story happening around you.
Yeah.
I'm not knocking the main character, but your main character is just choices.
Tav. You're just Tav.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just to throw this out there, like Baldur's Gate 3 starts with a really high stakes. Like you are on a Mind Flayer Nautiloid in hell with red dragons everywhere, demons, and extremely high level threats at the beginning of the game. And then you're dealing with goblins. It's a bit of a tonal whiplash that happens at the start of the game too. And I felt like the stakes were really high at the start of the game, and then it kind of takes this weird like nosedive with the time pressure and getting to know everybody, not in a bad way, just tonally, like it's a weird a weird trough to go through. Whereas I would have rather felt like I like a more natural build up in my TTRPG campaigns. Like you don't need to do, often in media res is a very popular way to start a video game, but you don't need to do that in a tabletop game.
As a final note, I think probably one of the best examples of good character writing in Baldur's Gate 3 is the relationship that develops with Karlach and Will. If you want an example of if you have two-player characters who are at odds, but you've communicated the idea that the whole goal of your story arc is to overcome those odds, Karlach and Will are a prime example of that.
So I'm going to confess that I am a horrible save scummer when it comes to Baldur's Gate 3. And I found the game very frustrating in the respect that most of the time when you fail the skill check in dialogue or in interacting with the environment, you weren't put on a different path in the game. You just had a door slam shut in front of you, right? And in some cases, literally, it was like, you can't do that side quest because you failed this skill check. You can't explore that room because you failed the skill check. You don't get to have that companion because you failed the skill check. You don't get that quest reward because you failed that one skill check. Rather than the game pulling you down a true alternate path with interesting results, most of the time in Baldur's Gate 3, failing a skill check means you don't get the shiny thing. I contrast this to a game like Disco Elysium, where failed skill checks were often just as interesting as the successful ones.
There were so many times in my playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3 where I wouldn't usually save scum, but the amount of lockpicks that I stockpiled, and I would sit there being like, oh, I need a 20 to open this door. Well, I really want to know what's on the other side of this door. It feels important. Oh, I rolled a 1. Oh, I rolled a 3. Oh, yeah. And I would just sit there, like I would be on my phone pressing reroll until I eventually got it.
And this is also super frustrating too, because a nat 1 is a fail on a skill check regardless. So like, even though you get the menu in the interface where you can stack the buffs up, so you have the amazing bonus, you have the advantage, and you have all the inspiration rerolls, it was so frustrating when like you'd go to open a DC 10 lock or try to pass like a DC 15 persuasion check only to roll the nat 1.
Yeah.
And then be just cut off from an entire, in some cases, quest chain or set of outcomes that were more narratively interesting than what you might have preferred. And so I think the takeaway from this is that, in many respects, it was very similar to the way that the Bethesda Fallout games are, where it's just like, was your skill level high enough?
When Fallout has like the grayed out option and it's like, your skill's not high enough to choose this dialogue option. And you're like, well, that sucks.
It's kind of like that lock and key style approach to dialogue options and paths. It's like, it's either you are able to open the door or you're not. Baldur's Gate 3 still does a really good job at giving you a lot of different options. Like, a failed skill check doesn't generally cut you off completely from the approach that you're trying to do. There's a lot of different ways to solve all the problems in the game. And so that's where Larian's skill at building their adventure overall makes up for this one flaw that they generally implement. There's more than one way to deal with the goblins. There is more than one way to deal with the druids. There's a whole bunch of different approaches that you can take to any situation. So if you fail at any one track, there's always another way forward. But it just does mean that like those options close off to you one by one by one by one. And in many cases, it's just like, okay, so you failed the skill check and now you have to fight.
Kind of on the same token, you can miss a lot of elements of the game simply by not looking in the right places. This isn't necessarily a skill check, but if we're playing D&D at the table, generally speaking, there's this tool that we've talked about a lot on this channel where a great skill for a DM is if you have an important bit over in the cabin in the woods that's to the right and the players go left, you simply take the cabin that they didn't even know was there and you put it on the right side of the woods.
Yes, the quantum ogre technique.
Yeah, so you move the important things that your players need to find to the places where they're going to find them. But in Baldur's Gate 3, they don't have that ability because things are in a set location. So if you never found the portal with Gale's arm sticking out of it, and then later you go online and you're like, who the heck is Gale?
Yeah.
I know people that never found Asterion, which is surprising to me because he's slightly to the left of where you first start.
I've heard basically the only companion that basically isn't skippable is Shadowheart because she's right there.
But you can also not open that thing and just escape with Lae'zel.
No, but even if you do, I think Shadowheart still ends up on the beat.
Oh, cool.
Right? You can't, you basically can't miss Shadowheart.
Well, I think she's also the only one that's like directly tied to a major plot point.
Of course, I'm pretty sure you can kill her right off the bat. Like, you can kill them all off the bat. My favorite thing with Dark Urge was slapping Gale's hand and it getting cut off by the portal, which was hilarious. The second only to kicking the squirrel. But horrible, but hilarious. It does blow me away. Like, I think I've heard of Will being missed. I've heard of Karlach being missed. I've heard of every companion except Shadowheart, I've heard of someone missing on their first playthrough.
Yeah.
Because they didn't know where to find them.
And it's not just characters. Like, there are actual plot threads that you don't necessarily know what to click on or where to look, so you didn't pick up the random item that was on the shelf in that little cave, and now you've missed out on an entire plot thread.
People miss the entire Underdark. They miss Grimforge. They miss a ton of things. And this is where, as a dungeon master, if you were writing your campaign and you had designed a dungeon like Grimforge, you probably don't want your players to miss that, even though it's like there's elements of it that are like kind of optional, or you can miss the whole Githyanki crash too.
So I was talking to my friend and he was like, I don't like Lae'zel. And I was like, well, if you don't like her now, just bring her along for the Githyanki crash. And he's like, what's that? I was like, where are you in the game? He's like, halfway through Act 2.
Yeah.
And I was like, never mind. Don't worry about it.
Right. And then especially like in Act 3, it's so sprawling that there's so much stuff that you can miss.
It's a little overwhelming.
Yeah, it is. It's I found Act 3 was the hardest part to get into because it felt like there were so many different directions to go in, and especially resolving all your companions' plot arcs and whatnot. And then at the same time as like the doors mysteriously closing, there's a couple moments in the game that are weirdly railroady too. I obviously wasn't using a controller. I almost threw my mouse at the screen in that first fight with Ketherick because I one round killed that jerk. And if it had have been me as a player character in a campaign, he would not have escaped. And I'm just going to call out Larian. That was the most, I hate it when the villain just gets to escape for free. If it's earned, then fine. But because the game is so good. The game is so good at letting you like just trounce and kill everybody. But the fact that Ketherick's escape is basically hard-coded into the game stands out for me as one of the most frustrating elements of the experience.
Now talking about railroading, I do want to point this out, that it's interesting that Larian both is so open-ended that you miss things, or at certain points so railroaded that you're forced to do things.
Yeah.
And I talked earlier about moving the cabin or the in the woods, but I do want to say that like that's not the same as railroading. And if you are at the table, you want to make sure that your players have choice and agency and that their choices matter, but not to the point where their choice is, if you say there's a creepy castle on the hill and that's where the plot is taking us, you would say that in obviously a different way. And they say, we're leaving town and going somewhere else.
Yeah.
That feels like that's not what you want at the table. And like, if you're playing Baldur's Gate and you choose to ignore most of the crash site because you're hightailing it as like along the path and you only pick up 2 companions on your way, that kind of feels like it sucks.
Yeah, and there's also weird things in the game where there's a whole bunch of interactions that can occur where if you don't bring a companion with you to a certain location, you miss out on really cool story beats or things. Like the entire Gauntlet of Shar is basically built for you to take Shadowheart
And the Githyanki Crush
with
Lae'zel.
with Lae'zel. I really think that
I mean,
the Mind Flayer colony, you should really bring Will for that.
And if you don't bring Astarion into the vampire hideout, then like, what are you even doing?
Yeah.
And
right.
that was the one thing is playing Baldur's Gate 3, I tried not to look too much up, but I had a document open on which companions to bring on which quests, because I didn't want to miss their plot lines.
Yeah, and so that was one of those things where I kind of felt like, even though the opposite of railroading, I wouldn't have... it would be okay if there was a little bit of signposting where, like, if you went into a location, like, the companion that was relevant to there showed up and been like, hey, I've been wanting to come here for a while. Can I come along?
And it gives you an option to change out your party because that companion is...
Yes.
And, like, that would have been preferred.
Yeah, right? And so I do think that, like, there's... It's weird how between the skill checks and sometimes the railroading matters, sometimes it doesn't. And I would just say that, again, it's not that Larian messed any of this up because the whole product works really, really well. But these are really great examples of things that if you didn't execute them as well as Larian did, they would feel really, really bad in game, right? Especially the Ketheric thing being the thing where I'm just like, I'm going to wave my finger at Larian and be like, I should have been able to kill him on top of Moonrise Towers. He should have been dead, and the entire Mind Flayer colony should have had an alternate path where he was already dead down there, right? And yeah, and by a similar token, like at the end of the Mind Flayer colony, I don't understand why you have to stand there and watch Gortash, Orin, and Ketheric have their little dialogue, especially because if you bring Gale, you can have Gale just blow everybody up in that moment. And I didn't understand why I couldn't just attack them. I'll tell you, Gortash, Orin, and Ketheric, I could have taken on all 3 of them at the same time with my party. They were no big deal. I would have loved to have been able to take all 3 of them and the Elder Brain on at the same time, just to have the challenge of trying to do that.
And that concludes our section on skill checks. Monty's got beef.
You know what it is? Baldur's Gate 3 gives you so much freedom in so many places, and it's so well done, that the places where it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb.
I agree. Yeah. I agree. Overall, again, we're talking about our gripes with a game that is like 99% perfect. So keep that in mind. Monty's got beef.
I know.
But Monty also loves beef.
Yeah, I love beef. I love beef.
So the game is amazing, and we've both beat it. We both like 2 thumbs up. But yeah, there's especially... These are definitely elements. Do not do that. Do not railroad your players, but also don't have them miss vital parts of your story because it's like, oh, if they went the wrong direction, guess they don't find the key that opens the castle that they need to go to beat the game. When they get there, they're going to be like, oh, we can't get in. And then you're like, sorry, campaign over. No, none of that makes sense.
And if you're going to put them in the same room as the villains, when the villains reveal their evil plan, you have to allow them to attack if you want.
I've made that mistake. Like early on in my DMing career, I put the villain in front of them and they just murdered him. And I was like, oh, he was supposed to get away. But I learned a lesson in that moment as a young DM, not to put your villain in front of your players because they're just going to murder him. Yeah. But in a video game, you can have a cutscene where you do that, but the whole time you're sitting there being like, why can't I just murder them?
Because in contrast with that, in the Goblin Camp, you can just assassinate Minthara and the Shaman and the Bugbear Warlord without ever talking to them, right? Like, had that moment been set up in the same way that the Goblin Camp was set up, you would have been able to go in, see Gortash, Ketheric, and Orin talking, and like done all that barrelmancy that you wanted to do and blown them up.
Speaking of blowing things up, a lot of combat encounters in this game get blown out of proportion. And it's not, again, that this is a mistake at the table. Often we do have combat encounters with lots of enemies, but it's about the game doesn't have the abilities that a dungeon master has. So the game runs each model at the table or character in the encounter individually. And so there are combat encounters, especially towards the end of the game, where you have 20 to 30 enemies, plus you have friendlies as well as your party. So there were literally times that I would take my party's turns because somehow our initiatives were always grouped together and we were pretty close to one another. Or there was like 3 and then one person, 20 people down. And then I would go on my phone and look up every once in a while and be like, anybody die? No? All right, cool. Which is not, especially at a D&D table, that's not what you want. You don't want your players going on the phone.
See, I couldn't do that because I had like things like Lucky and Luck of the Far Realms and Counterspell and Shield. So then not only would you have to process every enemy turn, but then every time there was a die roll, the prompts would come up asking you if you wanted to like manipulate the dice. And, you know, I noticed this first actually quite early in the game with the Goblin Camp. You can kind of like aggro the entire Goblin Camp or the entire interior of that temple. And you end up with like, as you said, 20 to 30 NPCs.
And it's like hours
It is.
Of gameplay.
And some of them are spending their entire actions just dashing towards you because the encounter environment is so large and like the aggro range is really weirdly figured out in those moments.
And also in those moments, it felt like, you know, again, it's not that Baldur's Gate 3 is a slow running game, but there's always like it like
5th edition
loads.
D&D is a slow running system.
Yeah. But like in 5th edition D&D, if there's a character that's out of range, it's like, all right, these guys all move up and that took 2 seconds. But in Baldur's Gate 3, it's load screen, show character runs, end. Load next character runs. And like you're watching each one for probably about 30 seconds.
Yeah, and especially you get into these some types where like the encounters are really complex and like I've got a pretty beefy PC, but did you ever run into that time where the game would just kind of hang as like an NPC was trying to decide what to actually do with their turn?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would like load and they'd sit there and you'd be like, is my game broken? And then all of a sudden they would move. So again, there's not really another choice in Baldur's Gate 3, but if you're playing it at the table, group like creatures together. Mm-hmm. If you have minions, if you have 20 skeleton archers, then if you have 20, I would actually come up with a system where I roll like, group them by like 5s and roll attacks that do additional damage for each group. But if you have, let's say 10, I would just take their turn all at once.
Especially when they have things like multi-attack. I find that increasingly for myself when I'm designing monsters and when I'm building monsters for my own games, I try to give fewer monsters multi-attack and give more monsters just a bigger damage number. So I only have to roll I literally have to roll fewer dice. And like it gets really bad in Act 3. Like I'm thinking of the final Shar temple. Like that's just a ton of NPCs that they dump on you there. The fight with Orin, you can have a ton of NPCs happening. The Steel Watch Foundry was really bad for this too. Like, cause especially when like you have the prisoners uprising happening inside it. And even for me, the absolute worst one was the final ascent up the Netherbrain. Like that encounter was just such a slog, especially because it was so spread out. And I don't know how it happened for me, but in my first playthrough, like I ended up triggering multiple encounters at the same time. And I had this huge thing. And then you have like the environmental effects and you have the summons and all these things. And it was just, it made the climactic encounter of the adventure kind of sluggish.
Yeah, and I felt that a little bit towards the end of the game, that combat encounters are starting to feel sluggish. And like, again, I don't know what the solution for Baldur's Gate 3 would be in that regard. Whereas at the table, I'll pick up like 5 D20s at once and be like, okay, what's your AC? They're all going to shoot you. Oh, your AC is 18.
Yeah.
That means that I need a 15 for these skeleton archers or whatever it is. And then I just roll and I'm like, okay, 3 of them hit.
Yeah, and that's a weird engine limitation.
Yeah, and that's something. So if you're designing encounters for the table, limit the amount of creatures you're using. If the party's a higher level, put higher damaging, bigger enemies. Don't use 20 to 30. And if you are doing something like a large scale battle, a war, or like a battle between 2 large groups, what you should actually do is narrate most of it in role play and let the players deal with a small group of those enemies.
Mhm.
Oh, a group of goblins is fighting against the steel watch in the background while you're dealing with the main issue.
Especially when there are friendly allies involved that the players can't control. That's where, if you got a bunch of NPC allies that are fighting a bunch of enemies, put them off to the side, narrate what's happening there, don't bother rolling it out, and then focus on the encounter with the PCs and their immediate adversaries.
The last one is the Monty Haul. The Monty Haul.
Named for the game show host, not me.
No. But Baldur's Gate 3 got rid of attunement as well as many other rules that we think are probably pretty important, but that's a different story. But then they shower you with lots of magic items, really overpowered magic items, lots of consumables, random useless items. I was always over encumbered, and you could kind of build your characters to be super insane magic item wielding monsters. And it just like, I had a hard time managing my inventory.
It was really hard to give away magic items except for the 3 that you need to feed Gale. And fortunately, there were a few easy candidates to do for that. But even very early into Act 1, it becomes readily apparent that you are going to have a ton of magic items for your characters. And I do think that I have a lot of positive things to say about the magic item design in Baldur's Gate 3. I think that Larian did a masterful job at creating some magic items with some really unique and interesting effects, many of which that I would love to start and have started bringing into my own tabletop games. Problem with it is that you get really OP with magic items and in BG3, and I do think one of my favorite, I would love it if there was an optional, like a mod to turn attunement back on, or I've heard a couple of people doing a pauper mode playthrough where you're only allowed to use 1 magic item or no magic items per character. And I do think that like part of what makes the game really, really easy, even on tactician and honor mode, is just how many magic items you can stack up on the party, and just how powerful that makes you, especially towards the end of the game.
I think that one of the big things is that in video games, we see this a lot. Diablo does this. Borderlands does this. It's just raining magic items
Loot's
on
fun.
you. Loot is fun.
Yeah.
But when we actually look at the tabletop version of D&D, loot is also fun, but I think that the narratives that we're trying to tell in a D&D game are closer to something like Lord of the Rings, where it's like you forge the sacred blade to give to the fighter ranger, to be like, this is your magic item. Frodo and Sam get cloaks of elvenkind. Frodo gets, he has a cursed ring, and he gets mithril armor and sting. So he's kind of well equipped. But most of the characters get 1 to 3 iconic items through the Lord of the Rings narrative that are like, they have stories behind them. They have history. Yeah. There's like a legend. You feel like you're carrying a really cool magic item with a long legacy. Whereas in Baldur's Gate 3, it's like, hey, you want to buy these boots? They make you go fast. And you're like, nice.
Or like, here's all the items that give you a +1, or here's all the items that change your stats. And the stat changing items like the headband of intellect or like the club that increases your strength or the various gauntlets and amulets that set your con really high. Those are such weird items because you can then get those items and then retrain the character.
So that you dump that stat.
So like I built Asterion as my ranger, but he wore the gloves of dexterity the whole game. So his actual dexterity score was 8.
Yeah, but I dropped my own intelligence as low as it would go because I found the headband of intellect.
Yeah, and so if you really want to min-max it, you kind of end up with these weird things that you can do thanks to the way that you can retrain through withers. But in general, I think my biggest takeaway that I would caution any dungeon master from is like, get inspired by the magic items in Baldur's Gate 3. If there's ones that you really like, copy them and bring them into your game. 100%. Just not at the quantity that Baldur's Gate 3 gives you, and don't like, and especially without attunement.
It's more fun at the table, like I said, to bring a story behind your magic items, make them part of the narrative. Baldur's Gate 3, it's so fun to design a character who takes the right magic items to influence a build. That's part of the fun of a video game. But at the table, the narrative is more fun. You're not playing a video game. I forget what's in my inventory at the table all the time, and I'm not going to go through it. I like knowing what my cool magic items are.
And as always, I barely used all the consumables, but like I've read about the strategies around optimizing your Baldur's Gate 3 playthrough around potions and elixirs and stuff like that. And it's a huge power jump when you actually make active use of those items.
I probably should drink a potion at some point.
Or the fact now, another thing that I like that anybody in Baldur's Gate 3 can use a scroll.
Yeah.
And that's something that the way that I run it in my games anyways. And I do like that like potions and scrolls are available. I think that consumables are really cool. I just think that the number of permanent magic items that you have, and there are certain permanent magic items that you're just like, why? Like no. Like the potent robes, the one that adds your charisma to spell damage. Those are really good.
Yeah, let's bring those in.
Yeah, or
for
like
my sorcerer.
No. And definitely like there was a lot of stuff with all the magic item stacking. The one thing that I do like is like all of the thrown weapon optimization that you can do.
I know you.
That was really cool, especially with Tavern Brawler and everything.
That's something I would bring into a game if there was a character who really wanted to play like a thrower.
Yeah, but that's where like, okay, do you need to do that through magic items, or is that something we could do through some subclasses, some class features, and some feats as well, right? So that it was a little bit more restrained on how it worked. But the throw and magic, like the fact that a throwing character is super viable in Baldur's Gate 3 was really cool. And I do like how the magic items enabled a bunch of different builds to work in really cool ways. I just also like, my sorcerer was a god. It was insane. Overall, don't give out as many magic items as Baldur's Gate 3 does.
So all of these issues aside, again, Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the most incredible video games that we've played, and it gets away with all of these because of the attention and the care that it was put into perfecting everything surrounding these options and why these options are presented the way that they are. Some of these I still do have gripes with, but I can some of these I do have gripes with even in the design work of Baldur's Gate 3, but I can overlook them because of how amazing everything else is. Some of these were designed intentionally for a video game, but might not work the same at your table. There's a lot of great takeaways and a lot of great lessons that we can learn from Baldur's Gate 3, but if your introduction to Dungeons & Dragons is Baldur's Gate 3, I think it's really important to know that jumping to the tabletop version of D&D is not going to be the exact same, and that some of the rules that Larian Studios decided to leave behind, some of the changes that they implemented, and some of the design that they did doesn't necessarily work the same at the table. And D&D at the table is a very beautiful, amazing game as well. And I think that it's important to know the differences between these. If there are any other elements of the design of Baldur's Gate 3 that you think probably don't work at the table, tell us about what those are in the comments below.
The videos that we make on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters, who I'm sure many of our patrons will be quick to point out the design mistakes that we've made in our own campaigns and in our own work. So we're not perfect, but the conversation is a fun one to have about what we can learn and improve. And if you want to join that conversation by getting on our community, follow the links down below to become a patron of our show.
And if you want to point out our design mistakes or just see what a tabletop D&D game looks like, you can check out our actual play in the Worlds of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on our YouTube channel. You can check out all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more advice for game masters and dungeon masters right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
in the dungeon.